Hey everyone, welcome back to Music Appreciation. I hope you had a great Labor Day weekend. Taking a look at the calendar here, for today, September 5th, we will be covering Chapter 3 and its corresponding recording. So you can find the music recording through MyLab Music, and instructions for activating your access code for that can be found on our Blackboard page here over on the left. So you'll need the course ID, which is right here, and more detailed instructions are attached as a PDF if you have other questions. All right, so we spent the first 2 weeks of this course covering the 8 elements of music, defining sort of basic music vocabulary. So today we'll start actually putting that into practice by analyzing a specific piece of music. So we'll begin the semester by working through kind of a survey of music history here. So we'll start with the Middle Ages and move through the Renaissance, Baroque, Classical, Romantic, and then the 20th century, and then we'll finish out the semester talking about popular music. So we're not actually going to spend that much time in the semester talking about the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, but they're a great place to start and sort of apply our understanding of the 8 elements of music. So the word medieval itself can be divided up into 2 root words, medi, which means middle, and evil, which means time. So the medieval period is also known as the Middle Ages. You can kind of use those interchangeably. And this is a very large time period. It spans about 1,000 years, 400 to 1400. So of course there's a lot of change that happens over the course of the Middle Ages. So we obviously can't get into all of that in this course, but it is an important starting point for the study of music history. So 3 important vocabulary terms that we'll need to know throughout the semester would be notation, sacred, and secular. So sacred, of course, means anything that's related to religion. So sacred music is generally used in the practice of a worship service. And secular music is the opposite of that. It's a very large category that really just means anything that is not related to religion. It's not used for worship. And very often it's used for entertainment or for personal expression. So you can think of dance songs or love songs, for example, as being secular music. And finally, notation is important. Notation can be broadly defined as the recording of musical sounds by actually writing them down on paper. And that's important for our purposes here, because until people actually figure out how to write down music so that it can be passed along to other generations, there's really no way to study or perform older music, of course. So that's an important concept for us here, and we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about the development of musical notation. Over here on the right, you can see a painting of medieval musicians. This is from the Middle Ages. And they are performing on various types of musical instruments. We've got looks like a bagpipe over here, and a lute, some sort of early fiddle, some drums, a horn up here. And musical instruments would be associated with secular music during the Middle Ages. It would be considered inappropriate or even vulgar to have musical instruments performed in a church. So anytime you see musical instruments, you know that that's indicating secular music. Okay, so talking about musical notation, and again, I don't expect that you know how to read musical notation. That's not necessary for this course. But it's just a fun side note here. You can see a very early piece of musical notation. We've got a Latin text right here, and any music that would be performed in the church during this time period would be in Latin. And above that, we've got what's called neumes. And these are just sort of basic graphic indications about the shape or the contour of a melody. So this neume right here, for example, would indicate that this line is rising, but other than that, it doesn't really give us any specific rhythm or pitch. So this was a development that took place over the course of about 1,000 years. All right, so the piece of music in chapter 3 that we're talking about today is a piece of sacred music. And so an important question for us to ask is why most of the earliest notated music that we have available comes from the medieval Christian church. And why is this? There's a couple of different answers to that. The church at this time period dominated both sacred and secular life. There really wasn't the same concept we have today of the separation of church and state. So that was very important. Education is also an important concept. Only clergy, so people a part of the church, so priests and monks and nuns, etc., or members of the royal family would be educated. Otherwise, there was really no sense of a middle class who was educated, so you really had to be kind of part of that elite to receive some sort of education. And through an education, you could learn how to perform music and write it down as well. Music was also central to the worship service, both the Mass, which was the public service, and also monks and nuns would pray together 9 times a day, and each one of these worship services was sung throughout. So it entirely centered around music. All right, so Caro, the song that we'll study for chapter 3 today, is considered to be a piece of plain chant. It's also called just purely chant, or you might hear it referred to as Gregorian chant. But this is a classification of sacred music that would be performed during this time period by either monks or nuns in a religious setting. And the purpose of this is to enhance and elevate the biblical text. So any text that comes from the Bible is considered to be especially important, of course, in a religious setting. So by setting it to music and singing it, you're indicating that it's especially important and meaningful. You would normally hear chant performed in the Middle Ages in a setting like you see here on the left. This is a picture of a medieval cathedral. And if you imagine yourself standing in this space, if you were a little person right over here, imagine yourself singing or speaking loudly in this setting. What do you imagine it would sound like? You've probably all been in, a similar cavernous space at some point, and you can probably imagine that your voice would echo quite a bit and carry very far, and there would be quite a bit of reverb. So that's important to keep in mind as we talk about the purpose and use of chant in the Middle Ages. So I want to show you a quick video here of some monks, this is obviously modern day, performing a piece of chant, much as we'll hear today. And they are in a similar space as a cathedral. We've got stone walls and floors and ceilings. It's a big open space. And they're all singing the exact same line together in unison. But the echo in the space provides quite an interesting resonant effect. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that the resonant space, the echo present in that cathedral actually creates sort of an artificial harmony because their voices start to layer on top of one another. So that's sort of the context you can imagine that the chant we'll study today would have been heard in. Okay, so some background on this piece, Caro from approximately the year 1275. That's what the C here means, circa. So we don't quite know exactly when it was composed, but we can guess here. So who was the composer? If you read the chapter, you'll know that the composer is labeled as being anonymous, so we don't actually know, and that's pretty typical for a lot of very early music. Composers didn't normally actually put their names on the pieces. As the genre, we can say that this is an example of plain chant, or Gregorian chant, however you'd like to say it. Who would be performing this piece? Like we just saw, it would either be performed by monks or by nuns, and the recording we'll hear today is the performance by monks, so it'll be a choir of men's voices. And this would be performed specifically for the Feast of Corpus Christi, so the celebration of the transformation of the Christ's body into blood and wine. So here's the text. Up on top in italics, I have laid it out in the original Latin, so this is actually how it's being sung in the recording. And below I have a translation in English. And you can see it's really only 4 sentences. It's quite short, although the piece itself is about 3 minutes long. So next I would like to listen to a recording of it through MyLab Music, which you also should have access to. So the page looks like this, and you can choose chapter 3 and listen to this first, and it should come up with this page. So I'll play it, and then we will switch over to the lyrics. Okay, so I'm going to pause it there. If you're trying to follow along here, you might have noticed that we just finished singing this very first word, Alleluia, here. It was sung by a soloist, and then a choir joins in to accompany that person. So we're about 30 seconds into the song, and we're still on this one single word here, Alleluia, 4 syllables. So it's a great example of a melismatic text setting, which we discussed in relation to word-music relationships. There are multiple pitches per syllable there, and you can see that we're really dragging out the Alleluia. So next, the choir is going to join in and repeat this Alleluia that we just heard. And although there's multiple people singing at the same time, we're still a monophonic line, no harmony, everyone is singing in unison. Here we enter into the main verse. Very melismatic. And here the choir joins in once again in a unison line on the word Alleluia. And that's it. All right, so let's think about this in terms of the 8 elements of music. If we were to divide it up into each of the independent elements here, we could talk about melody, dynamics, rhythm, harmony, texture, timbre, form, and word music relationships. So on the next slide here, I have completed this sort of listening chart. If we talk about the melody, we've got a pretty small range, a very smooth contour. And that's important in this context because it needs to be easy to sing, because it's expected that all of the monks would be able to sing this at the same time. It's not meant to be very virtuosic because that would be distracting and considered to be, sort of narcissistic if you perform something too virtuosic. So relatively easy to sing. In terms of dynamics or the volume, there really are, you probably noticed, no extremes. There's nothing terribly soft or terribly loud. They're all singing kind of at the same dynamic throughout, although of course once the choir enters it's a little bit louder, but otherwise it's pretty consistent. Rhythm is an important aspect here because there actually isn't any rhythm, so it's considered to be unmetered. It's really just sort of follows the shape of the text, but if you were to go back and listen to it again, if you tried to tap your foot along to it, you'd have a hard time sort of latching on to a consistent underlying beat, so it's not actually metered. In terms of harmony, this is considered to be a monophonic work, meaning everyone is singing in unison, they're singing the same line, there is no accompaniment, so we'll say that this has no harmony whatsoever. In terms of texture, once again, this is monophonic, so the simplest texture. We won't see very many other examples of monophony throughout the semester, but it's quite common for the Middle Ages. Talking about timbre, this is considered to be responsorial, meaning you have sort of a call and response aspect to it. So we start out with the soloist, one single person, then the choir joins in, and then we end with a single person as well. So they're kind of going back and forth between those two groups. If you talk about instrumentation, we'll consider this to be a vocal work, so a choir only singing, no musical instruments. In terms of form, and I'm going to go back to the text here. Again, form is really just differentiating between sections that serve different purposes. So you can see down here with the English translation, we have Alleluia, then we have these 2 sentences right here. We can consider that to be the verse, and then we end up with Alleluia once again. So oops, I don't know what I just did. So we can consider this to be, in its most basic sense, you could label these as being maybe A, this middle section as being B because it's something different, and this final section as being A because it's repeating what we saw at the very beginning. So that's kind of how we can describe form. So we'll say it's an ABA. We've got the Alleluia, the verse, and then the Alleluia. And in terms of word music relationships, as I mentioned with that first Alleluia, it's quite melismatic, and that's to indicate the importance of that particular line of text. Okay, so that's a basic analysis of Caro, an example of medieval Gregorian or plain chant. So I encourage you to watch this video, listen to the song or the piece of music on your own time, and make sure that you kind of understand how each one of these elements of music relate to that recording. Thank you for watching.